In medieval Europe, if your belly hurt, your skin turned splotchy, or you felt a little melancholy, you might find yourself holding a toad, alive, pressed thoughtfully against your skin, preferably with someone chanting nearby, whispering Latin that may or may not have been improvised. Now, let's float gently backward into a time when the moon influenced your liver, doctors feared cucumbers, and your daily medical advice came from a man who had never seen the inside of a body, but had definitely sniffed enough herbs to write a small opera. We begin in a sleepy English village in the 1300s, where the local physician, a man named Gilbert, who owned exactly one book, smelled faintly of onions, and once treated gout with mashed cherries, was called in to consult on a troubling case of blue feet. He arrived at the cottage puffing slightly, having tripped over his long robes, which were, as per regulation, at least 2 sizes too large and entirely impractical for muddy roads. Gilbert approached the patient, a nervous woman named Agnes, who had indeed developed an alarming pair of bluish feet. She'd noticed it the morning after standing barefoot in a damp field singing ballads to a stork, which had felt like a good idea at the time, to quote Agnes herself. Gilbert, consulting his prized possession, an aging medical text written in Latin badly translated from Arabic, which was itself translated from several Greek scrolls, diagnosed Agnes with an imbalance of the humours, predominantly phlegmatic and melancholic, with possible lunar interference. Naturally, the treatment prescribed was a regimen of warm wine foot baths, 3 weeks of strictly no singing after sundown, and sitting beside a fire while holding 9 acorns scrupulously collected from the east side of an oak tree. Not the west. That's witchcraft territory, obviously. Now, to be fair, the medieval world did not lack curiosity, just reliable evidence. The human body, to most of Europe, was a mysterious sack of hot liquids and occasional vapors. Understanding it meant interpreting signs from nature, the stars, or your own unfortunate dreams. A man named Bartholomew the Respectable once wrote that dreams about leeches foretold good digestion, while dreams about cheese meant your spleen was pouting. Yes, your spleen. But back to Agnes. After a week of acorns, her feet were still distinctly blue. Not discouraged, Gilbert upped the treatment. He prescribed what was widely believed to be a miracle cure for bodily imbalances: theriac. Now, theriac was a kind of medieval smoothie, an ambitious mixture of up to 70 ingredients including opium, ground viper, cinnamon, and, depending on your saltiness, possibly bitumen scraped from ancient statues. People believed it cured poison, plague, and spiritual malaise, which, to be fair, opium alone might do, at least temporarily. Brewed in small cauldrons by apothecaries who were equal parts pharmacist, wizard, and occasional beekeeper. Theriac was both a medicine and, rather adorably, a status symbol. Royals collected varieties the way medieval teenagers collected pilgrim badges. King Charles V of France once had theriac aged like wine, which, if nothing else, gives you a sense of how sophisticated flavour palates of the day were, ever so heroically overlooking the flavour of viper. Agnes grimaced through a spoonful of the stuff and reported tingling in both elbows and a lust for cabbage. Gilbert took this as a sign of improvement. Days later, her feet returned to a soft, healthy pink, though it may have simply been the weather turning. And such was healing in the Middle Ages. It was, more often than not, a melange of guesswork, gallantry, and good fortune. Disease was a divine riddle to be slowly untangled with onions, prayers, and perhaps a spot of goat urine if things got particularly dramatic. Even today, we marvel at the sheer creativity of it, how humans, with little to go on and a lot going wrong, kept going, kept trying, kept stirring vinegar with rose petals and calling it science. And while it all sounds delightfully ridiculous from the comfort of your pillow, nestled beneath a duvet that's never once been accused of containing serpents, it's also oddly comforting. That eternal quest to understand our mysterious meat suits started long before MRIs or hand sanitizer. It started with blue feet, a man named Gilbert, and 9 acorns placed respectfully in your lap. If these stories help you drift off, please subscribe to the channel. It would mean the world to me. And before you fully fade into dreamland, I would love to know where you're listening from and what time it is there. Now, close your eyes and settle in deeper. There's much more to explore beneath the layers of lavender poultices and misguided moon theories. By the flickering firelight of the 1300s, where pigs freely wandered the streets and sewer, systems were but a glimmer in someone else's century. The idea of healthcare often meant placing your trust in whatever village elder had managed to live longest and loudest. And there, in the heart of medieval medical wisdom, nestled perhaps one of the era's more fragrant beliefs, the noble art of odor-based diagnostics. Yes, the prevailing theory among many physicians, or leeches as they were flattering called, was that scent was a reliable pathway to medical truth. One 14th century medical manual politely suggested that a physician could detect disease from the aroma of a patient's sweat, breath, or worse rearward emissions. Imagine, if you will, Sir Geoffrey the medic solemnly leaning in, giving your armpit a dignified sniff, then gravely announcing, "Ah yes, the stench of melancholy, slightly touched by spleen disorder." Hygiene, of course, was seen as somewhat suspicious. Bathing too regularly was believed to open the skin's pores and therefore render one susceptible to airborne demons. One chronicler even noted that water could physically weaken one's humours, those 4 mysterious bodily elements that medieval medicine danced around like a particularly ineffective square dance. Thus, it wasn't uncommon for even royalty to bathe once or twice a year. A triumphant 1292 report from Paris recorded Queen Joanna's annual bath as a sign of moral endurance. Perfume, on the other hand, was the acceptable substitute. Cloaked in lavender sachets and the lingering scent of dried rose petals, people would brave basements of pestilence and not bat an eye, mostly because their noses had long since surrendered. Entire classes of health practices emerged involving smelling herbs, often bundled into little satchels and waved dramatically beneath one's nose like a Victorian lady fainting at the opera. And speaking of fainting, one delightful remedy for unconsciousness in the Middle Ages was a dose of slightly rotted goat lung, boiled in vinegar and applied to the nose. The logic behind this curious concoction? Well, it was thought to counteract the impure air trapped within the afflicted soul, by apparently replacing it with a different kind of impure air. Whiffs of horror to awaken the dainty. During the Great Plague, physicians wore those now iconic bird-beaked masks, not as avant-garde fashion, but as a public health measure, as interpreted by someone who had clearly never studied public health. These plague masks were stuffed with aromatic herbs, resins, and the occasional slice of dried orange, designed to ward off miasma, the invisible and ominously scented fog they believed carried disease. Instead of treating the Black Death with cleanliness or isolation, they combated it with a wearable fruit basket and a solid sense of denial. In some parts of Europe, the particularly devout attempted to purify the air of sin by burning bundles of rosemary, myrrh, or, curiously, dried dung. Historically speaking, that last method did not quite receive universal acclaim from neighbours who preferred their air dung-free. But such was the depth of belief in the magical scent-fueled medicine of the day. If it smelled strong enough to make you cry, it must be working. The rules of scent extended even to the food one consumed. Too many odorous onions or garlicky pastes in your diet might result in unbalanced humours. One monk wrote that those who consume leeks with greedy fervour shall find the wind in their bellies excitable and unruly. Culinary guidance with gastrointestinal poetry, as you might call it. Even dreams were thought to be scent reactive. One 12th century text suggested that if you wish to avoid nightmares, you ought to place fragrant violets beneath your pillow, while other more optimistic scholars insisted on sage, thyme, or, rather confidently, St. John's wort, as if that alone could fend off demons and taxes. Of course, most of these olfactory strategies neither extended lifespans nor improved anyone's chances of avoiding the considerable hazards of medieval life: plague, famine, rats, and the ever-present possibility of an accidental jousting. But as far as dream-like belief systems go, there's something almost endearing about the idea that healing could be found in a handful of herbs and an assertive sniff. Drifting through the incense-stained corridors of time, we leave behind the era of nasal diagnostics and prepare to spend the next moonlit chapter somewhere equally improbable. Perhaps where the stars could diagnose fevers, or where your urine's colour determined your mood. Gently now, we wander forward, threads of rosemary still lingering in the air. There's nothing quite like waking up with a mysterious headache and immediately blaming it on an angry toad you've never met. In medieval Europe, this was considered a reasonable diagnosis. People weren't being irrational. They simply hadn't invented Advil yet, and so their minds wandered into far squishier territory. Now, close your eyes and imagine a cottage dimly lit by beeswax candles, tucked beneath a mossy hill, where a local herbalist is cheerfully stuffing a dried hedgehog into a dusty sack, labelled "Headache Remedies Do Not Eat." Welcome to the odd, charming world of medieval medicine. Let us begin with the humours, not the funny kind, though they did keep physicians of the time delightfully and dangerously occupied. According to ancient medical theory, humans were like stews simmering with 4 essential ingredients: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. If the stew bubbled over with one too much of phlegm, well, say goodbye to your concentration and hello to a medieval enema made with warm goose fat and posies. Medieval doctors believed health was simply a matter of balancing these wobbly internal liquids. And what better way to restore equilibrium than by draining a pint or two of blood from your ankle by candlelight? Bloodletting was the go-to cure for practically everything, from fevers to bad moods, and possibly even for failing at chess. It was best done on Tuesdays, unless Mercury was in retrograde, in which case, never mind. Try garlic instead. Garlic, by the way, was not only considered food, but also a fierce warrior in the war against evil spirits and sinus pressure. People wore it around their necks, like nature's clove-scented fashion statement. Some swore that simply rubbing it on the soles of one's feet cured coughs. Others preferred to mix it with honey and smear it on unmentionable spots. Healing was a full-body commitment. Now, no trip through medieval wellness would be complete without mentioning astrology. A proper physician didn't dare prescribe leeches without first consulting the stars. If someone turned up with stomach cramps, a chart would be made. If the moon was in Virgo, congratulations. You were obviously suffering from melancholic breezes in the spleen. And if you were particularly unlucky, They might make you drink something called theriac, a luxurious potion made of nearly 70 ingredients, including viper flesh, opium, cinnamon, and possibly a teaspoon of optimism. Theriac was thought to treat nearly everything, especially poison. Wealthier folks kept it in ornate jars and sipped it with the seriousness of someone who's just learned their soup contains snake. Yet, perhaps the most baffling, your bones might just rattle from laughing, was the theory that illnesses could be expelled through pleasant smells. Perfumed apples were a popular remedy, especially during plague times. Citizens would walk around sniffing them, hoping sweet scents would override the sour stench of pestilence. A kind of potpourri pandemic response, you see. It wasn't all bad nonsense, of course. Herbal remedies often worked, though not always for the reasons people thought. A poultice of rosemary might reduce inflammation. Onions could draw out infections. The science was somewhere in there, hidden under layers of folklore and wishful thinking. Love potions, for instance, were both romantic and utterly unpredictable. One 14th century recipe called for grinding up dried mole hearts and mixing them with lettuce juice, served at night under a full moon on an empty stomach. Nothing says romance like warm rodent organ slurry. Midwives especially held vast stores of knowledge passed from hand to hand, knee to knee, in whispered stories and pungent salves. They were the unofficial doctors for most women, their herbal brews often more effective than anything a university-trained man with a collection of bloodletting knives could offer. And then there's the tragic comedy of the urine wheel, a painted diagram that helped physicians diagnose ailments by the color and smell of urine samples. Pale yellow meant health. Murky green suggested misbehavior in the liver. And red, possibly love, or beetroot. Hard to say. Rest now. Drift with the gentle clink of alembics and clove-soaked compresses. And imagine yourself under thick woolen blankets, scented with thyme and slightly too old lavender. The stars are shifting above the thatched eaves, but no need to consult them tonight. We'll leave your humours undisturbed, your bile unbothered. For now. Soon, under moon-kissed cloisters and crumbling castles, we'll wander deeper into a world where comfort was found in pigeons, poultices, and the peculiar notion that disease could be frightened away by a strong enough amulet and a stern lecture. Somewhere in the foggy glens of imagination and medieval misunderstanding, there existed a belief so charmingly ridiculous, it's hard not to love it a little, that sleeping with a chopped onion stuffed into one's sock could suck diseases right out of your body, like an extremely pungent foot vampire. Yes, the humble onion, cupboard staple, and tear-inducing menace was once considered an all-purpose panacea. Need to cure a cough. Onion. Suffering from the plague. Onion. Feeling melancholic over your oxen's recent bout of grumpiness. Rub some onion on your feet and soldier on. The reasoning, if one generously calls it that, was rooted in the ancient theory of miasma, the belief that disease floated about in poisonous air, bad odors, and night vapors that snuck into one's body like misbehaving gusts. So it seemed wonderfully clever, at the time, to keep a sliced onion nearby, or better yet, taped somewhere conveniently close to your various orifices. Naturally antimicrobial by modern scientific standards. Slightly, yes. Magical disease vacuum? Not so much. This sniffly superstition wasn't unique to onions, bless them. Garlic, leeks, and even musty herbs gathered under waning moonlight were recruited for their smell-based superhero powers. Rooms were fogged with fragrant bouquets to chase away the plague smog. Windows shut tight to block out any suspicious breezes, and personal, scent sachets dangled around necks like medieval AirPods, designed not to play music but to confuse airborne demons. But returning to the onions, one especially dreamy tradition called for placing raw slices in the corners of a room during an outbreak. The lurking hope was that, like some alchemical Roomba, they'd quietly absorb the sickness overnight, leaving behind a slightly soggy but otherwise martyr-like allium. Come morning, if the onion looked gross and discoloured, which onions naturally do after sitting out in old castles and damp thatch huts, that was taken as proof that it had valiantly sacrificed itself. Few people stopped to ask whether onions just rot. Meanwhile, if your humours were feeling particularly unbalanced, a medieval way of saying your vibes were off, smelling or even ingesting onion-based concoctions might be prescribed by an eager barber surgeon holding both a cleaver and a medical opinion. There existed entire recipe books and medical handbooks dedicated to these curious cures. One cheery gem instructed the ailing reader to boil onions in ale, stir in powdered wormwood, and drink fast, lest the evil vapours return, which, to give them credit, might at least make you forget you were unwell for a few hours or compel you never to fake sick again. Of course, like most medieval remedies, the onion was rarely left to work alone. Wise women and wandering monks might advise combining it with a hot stone to the belly or a purifying chant in Latin, because if a cure didn't make you a little sweaty, weepy, or spiritually confused, was it even trying? Now, nestled among these odoriferous beliefs was a curious side effect: onion fear. In more elite circles, where people wore towering hats and bathed less often than they hosted banquets, onions were believed by some to draw out not just illness, but personality traits. A sharp onion might purify your blood, but, according to one scribe from Yorkshire, could also make a person prone to sudden moods and eruptions of song. Imagine blaming your cousin's lute solo on vegetable influence. Delightfully convenient. And so, with the arrival of every new illness the Middle Ages threw at its exhausted population, fevers, fluxes, French-sounding plagues, came a renewed interest in the onion. It was diced and distilled, burnt and buried, worn on belts and tied beneath beds, sticky with superstition and unshakable optimism. Today, of course, we keep onions safely where they belong, in soups, on burgers, and perhaps still slightly intimidating in their raw, unyielding state. But back then, tucked into socks, or poised like a little bodyguard on the nightstand, they were as good as medicine got. Outside, the village cock crows once more, although it's entirely likely he's simply suspicious of the pungent fumes wafting from every cottage door. And inside, by candlelight, someone somewhere is still whispering a thank you to their loyal onion, quietly decomposing by the hearth. Let your mind drift now across the fields of folly, where more peculiar cures lie in wait. A realm where snails, stars, and sheep's dung all had their medicinal moments. But that, sleepy traveller, is a tale for another breath. Imagine waking up one morning in the late 14th century with a tickle behind your ear, the kind that foretells either the onset of a mild head cold or, in medieval thinking, your body's way of whispering to you, "Too much black bile, friend." You'd trudge off to the nearest physician, who looked more like a wizard's apprentice than a man of science, cloaked in velvet robes and an expression of grave authority, despite having apprenticed under someone who'd read 2 Aristotle scrolls and called it a day. The good doctor might press 3 fingertips gently against your wrist, gaze thoughtfully into the window, not unlike an actor forgetting his line, and declare with a flourish, that your humours were out of balance. Not to worry. He had leeches and a large jar of something unpronounceable to fix it all. You see, humoral theory was the real MVP of medieval medicine. Based on the teachings of Hippocrates and Galen, the entire body, and your very mood, if you can imagine, was governed by 4 fluids: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. If they weren't in perfect balance, you might develop a fever, melancholia, or a strong desire to shout at pigeons. The solution? Well, obviously, extract some of whichever humour was overachieving that day, preferably through a vein near your ankle. This is where bloodletting comes in, which sounds ominous, and frankly, was. Cloaked physicians would confidently slice open a vein and let you leak at leisure, possibly while you reclined on a fainting couch, wondering whether your humours preferred making you faint or merely lose consciousness from blood loss. If you were lucky, they might instead apply a leech or 2, or 20. Yes, leeches, nature's most determined freeloaders, were sold at markets, prescribed like aspirin, and considered excellent at rebalancing humours. To this day, leeches remain unbothered by their medieval reputation, quietly enjoying their strange fame. But let's say instead you were suffering from a headache. In our era, you might reach for ibuprofen. In theirs, you might reach for a live pigeon. One of the odder remedies recorded in the medical texts of the time involved splitting a pigeon open and placing its still warm body directly on the patient's head. The theory was elegant in its own confusing way. The pigeon's vital heat would draw the bad vapours out of your skull. One can only assume the pigeon was not thrilled about being repurposed as a forehead compress. Now, if your bowels were in revolt, as they often were, thanks to undercooked mutton and regrettable forays into questionable ale, your friendly healer might administer an enema, but not just any enema. These came in tones of lavender water, soot, vinegar, and even a foul-sounding concoction of bile from a sacrificed pig. The insertion tool, lovingly referred to as a clister, resembled a medieval pastry bag and was wielded with all the delicacy of a disgruntled chimney sweep. Patients were encouraged to lie down, pray to an appropriate saint, and hope for minimal splashing. Some health tips, on the other hand, were so far down the medieval rabbit hole that they practically emerged in another universe, like the belief that holding a dry toad in a sock around your neck could cure a sore throat. The toad, it was believed, absorbed the illness, heroically of course, leaving you croaky only in voice, not body. It's a comforting image really. Sir Croaks-a-Lot, valiantly sacrificing his mummified self to spare your tonsils. And let us not forget the great medieval love affair with astrology, your ailment. Entirely due to Saturn's moody sulking in the house of Virgo. Treatments were timed not just by your symptoms, but by the stars. A misplaced moon phase could mean the difference between successful healing and being accidentally bled to the point of collapse. At least your obituary would read cosmically. Of course, much of what masqueraded as medicine was purely imaginative improvisation, like tossing herbs into a fire while chanting to Saint Apollonia for toothaches. Not entirely surprising when you remember that dental surgery involved more yanking than diagnosing, usually with rusty pliers and a bottle of church-blessed schnapps. As odd as all this sounds from our cushy modern vantage point, there's a certain endearing bravery in it all. These were people trying, in earnest, to make sense of aches and ailments, long before x-rays or band-aids were a glimmer in anyone's dreams. They trusted in pigeons, leeches, stars, and saints. And sometimes, surprisingly, they even got better. Now, as we let the pigeons coo softly in the background, and the leeches do, whatever it is leeches do in their spare time, let us mosey onward to gentler matters of beauty. Perhaps where to smear some goose fat if you wish to become irresistible at a medieval banquet. Ah, sleep now, dear listener. But not so fast. We must first make a brief stop in the bustling, mucky streets of 14th century England, where the aroma of roasted meat mingled with something decidedly more pungent. Yes, that would be the medieval approach to cleanliness, which, much like their medical practices, involved an enchanting blend of firm-sounding nonsense and worryingly few actual baths. You see, in the Middle Ages, water was suspicious, a strange stance, considering it made up most of your body and nearly all of your soup. But to be fair, they had their reasons. Bathing too often, they thought, could open the pores, thereby allowing all manner of disease and invisible demon into one's body. And nobody wants that lurking in their spleen. Thus, your average medieval person, unless they were scandalously wealthy or had accidentally fallen into a stream, kept their skin as dry as a well-aged manuscript. Washing hands before dinner, optional. Washing hands after dinner, exotic. Washing hands at all, a little sus. Yet there was no shortage of advice. Oh no. Monks, barbers, and anyone who had once peeked into a dusty herbal manuscript became self-appointed health instructors. A popular tip from the time. To avoid falling ill, one must avoid sleeping in the moonlight. That's right. According to several esteemed thinkers, moonbeams could cause madness, swelling of the brain, or even general melancholia, which, to medieval folk, was just a fancy word for being sort of gloomy and prone to writing mysterious poetry. So instead of bathing, or, heaven forbid, ventilating a sick room, one might be advised to sleep with garlic under the pillow, a potato in the armpit, or a lily root mashed into a hat. This apparently would balance your internal humours, and if your humours weren't balanced, well, good luck digesting a turnip. You'd be thrown completely off kilter. Hot when you should be moist, or cold when you should be dry. The horror, but the medieval preference for dryness extended to hospitals as well. If you were unlucky enough to fall ill and rich enough to be treated, you'd find yourself tucked into sheets recently boiled in vinegar and ox urine. Because if there's one thing medieval folk trusted more than God, it was the intense scent of fermented cow bladder product. Speaking of hospitals, the staff were not quite what you picture today. Instead of smiling nurses and sterile instruments, you'd be in the capable, but slightly soiled, hands of monks who might pray the illness away, or barber surgeons who were often busier with amputations than niceties like anesthesia. For everyday illnesses like headaches or sore throats, the go-to advice often involved drinking wine infused with powdered coral or rubbing goose fat behind the ears beneath a waning moon. Medicine, it seemed, was part science, part astrology, and part wild guessing over a tankard of ale. One particularly charming favourite of the time was the notion of self-sweating. If you were ill, you should bundle yourself in blankets beside a roaring fireplace until your body released all misfortunes through a robust sweat. Essentially, they tried to microwave the illness out of you, which works exactly as well as it sounds. And if it didn't work, leeches, of course, always back to the leeches. Now, to be fair, some medieval folk did wash. Public bathhouses were popular in certain cities, especially before the Black Death turned everyone into amateur epidemiologists. But even then, bathing was less about hygiene and more about community. often doubling as social hubs where deals were struck and marriages arranged. Nothing sets the mood for a lifelong partnership like matching each other's foot fungus in a tepid wooden tub. Still, not everyone was content with sweaty blankets and moon avoiding. Wise women across the countryside brewed their own herbal remedies using lavender, rosemary, or even crushed beetles if the mood struck. Their knowledge, learned from generations of hands-on trial and error, often worked far better than the bleeding and chanting options officially endorsed by the authorities. It's comforting, in a strange way, to walk these soapy or unsoapy paths of the past, and remember that even with all their strange beliefs, medieval people were just doing their best to stay alive and not melt under the moon. Now, if you're feeling a little flushed yourself, perhaps best not to reach for your goose fat and coral-infused wine just yet. Instead, nestle deeper into your blankets and let's glide gently toward the next curious remedy, one that involves sheep parts, planetary alignment, and more than one questionable poultice. Let us drift now to the damp, flagstone corridors of a medieval monastery infirmary, where things smelled faintly of thyme, dust, and a lingering hint of beeswax. It was a place of hushed tones and clinking herbal concoctions, where monks with far more faith than medical training attempted to wrangle illness into submission, using techniques best described as imaginatively hopeful. You see, dear dreamer, medicine in the Middle Ages was less about what works and more about what sort of nonsense vaguely resembles science if we stare at it through a candle-lit haze and squint very hard. The monks, bless their sandal-strapped souls, truly believed in the power of the four humours, a theory that postulated your body was governed by four mysterious fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. If one was out of balance, you got the plague, or a stubbed toe, or spontaneous melancholy, which is just an old-fashioned word for Monday. Now, remedying this imbalance called for all manner of treatments, many of which involved letting your vital essence pour out of a small gash in your arm like regret from a poorly worded letter. This was known, quite ominously, as bloodletting. It didn't exactly work, but it certainly did something. Even if that something was simply making you woozy enough to forget why you came to the monastery in the first place. Leeches were common assistants in the procedure, slimy little doctors without degrees who enjoyed a snack and had zero opinions about your pulse rate. Leeches were, after all, portable, reusable, and made no fussy objections as long as you kept your skin moisturized. But if you were too squeamish for leeches or didn't have the dignity of a good bleeding, there were alternative therapies. One of the more charming, if tragically flawed approaches, involved the careful sniffing of flowers, herbs, and assorted substances, many of which you would not want near your nostrils unless your other option was a face full of miasma. Ah, yes, miasma theory. The belief that disease wandered the air like bad poetry, drifting through towns in foggy veils of pestilence. People wore little beak-shaped masks stuffed with roses, lavender, or cloves, not just because they made them look like suspicious ducks on a heist, but to block the invisible, evil air that apparently decided who got typhoid. Spoiler alert, the air wasn't the issue, but the mask did smell infinitely better than medieval alleyways on a warm afternoon. But one cannot discuss medieval wellness without stopping briefly to marvel at the miracle cure known as urine divination. That's right. Skilled practitioners known as uromancers would examine the color, clarity, and, somewhat distressingly, even the taste of urine to diagnose one's ailments. Your pee wasn't just a bodily function. It was a golden window into your soul. If it was too red, too pale, or had an emotional slump midstream, the physician would stroke his beard, nod solemnly, and announce something dire such as, "You've got too much phlegm," or, less scientifically, "Thou art cursed." Sometimes the treatments extended beyond body and bladder and into the divine. Pilgrimages to relics were common. If your tummy ached, the logical step was to travel 60 miles on foot to gaze upon the pinky bone of St. Mildred the Kind, preserved in a velvet box and believed to possess light administrative holiness. The hope, of course, was that proximity to Mildred's pinky would realign one's intestines, which says quite a lot about both medieval biology and their collective trust in extremely tiny saints. And we mustn't forget astrology. For what good is any diagnosis without knowing which celestial body was frowning at your liver that morning? Medieval physicians routinely consulted horoscopes before prescribing treatments. Mercury in retrograde? Probably best not to remove that arrow. Mars ascending? Time to cleanse your gallbladder with crushed emeralds dissolved in wine. If nothing else, it was a therapy best followed by a nap, assuming the emeralds didn't do you in first. But somewhere between all the bleeding and stargazing, something rather lovely happened. A glimmer of care, a sort of clunky, enthusiastic faith that even if we didn't quite understand what made people sick, we might figure it out if we just kept trying plants and prayers in different combinations. And sometimes, amid the absurdity, comfort bloomed. Now hush your mind and let it settle. For while the monks stirred their tonics and studied the stars, somewhere in the twilight of those candlelit corners, another secret was waiting. A whisper about what people believed the body could do on its own, if only given the right, mysterious nudge. On a chill spring morning in the year 1352, a peasant named Oswin of Wimbledon found himself both afflicted and blessed. Afflicted because he had what can only be described as excessive vapours of the spleen. Blessed because the village leech, that's medieval for doctor who applies insects, declared with tremendous confidence that he knew precisely how to fix it. The remedy, a soothing blend of boiled pigeon droppings, rosemary liqueur, a whispered prayer to Saint Apollonia, patron saint of teeth, inexplicably, and of course a ceremonial walk backward around the goat pen, while whistling, but only in a minor key. Now, it must be said, Oswin did get better, whether from the curative powers of pigeon poo, the saint, or simply the natural course of time, we'll never know. But what truly endured was the medical enthusiasm of the Middle Ages in all its imaginative glory. In this chapter of our winding slumberous scroll, let us examine a few of the less than scientific methods medieval people swore by, practices administered with the utmost seriousness and occasionally with a possum skull. To begin, let's ponder the popularity of urine diagnosis. Medieval physicians, who favoured robes, pointy shoes, and the conviction of absolute guesswork, believed that nearly all illnesses could be detected and possibly foretold by carefully analysing the colour, clarity, and aroma of one's waterworks. They even had urine charts. Picture something like a Renaissance paint sample brochure, with cheerful names like Stormy Barley and Mirthful Ochre. A tiny vial of the patient's golden mystery was held up to candlelight, while the physician squinted very solemnly and perhaps murmured, "Aha, this hue suggests a melancholy liver and a romantic imbalance of humours." Sometimes they'd taste it too, not as a dare, but as professional pride. It's said that experienced physicians could distinguish between the diabetes of melancholy and diabetes of passion. I'm not sure what's more shocking, the fact they could tell the difference, or that they tried. Now then, if you'd like, to be cured of demonic possession, not uncommon in times of unexplainable headaches or alarming dance moves, you were in luck. The church was more than happy to dispatch an exorcist, complete with incense, bells, and a Latin chant that sounded vaguely like someone getting food poisoning in cursive. Failing that, one might simply be shaved bald and locked in a quiet room with a jug of rainwater and a Bible translated into questionable French. There was also the curious custom of therapeutic bleeding, also known as why medieval doctors always carried a bowl. The theory was deceptively simple. You're ill because you have too much blood. Obviously. So out came the knives, or better yet, the leeches. Those slippery little freeloaders who made a handsome living sucking aristocratic elbows. There were even charts to indicate the optimal veins to open for whatever ailed you. Headaches came from the temples, melancholy from the ankle. Broken hearts generally from spending too much time at court. And yet, people felt better afterward. Why? Well, a mild loss of blood may indeed offer temporary relief for a few inflammatory conditions. Or it could be that lying down for a few days, drinking broth, and not being expected to plough anything was rather healing in itself. Next, we arrive at the popular concept of herbal amulets, little bags of kitchen-scented witchery, stuffed with marjoram, mugwort, or sometimes just whatever the dog had dragged in. These were hung about the neck to ward off illness, protect against plague, or in a few famously scandalous cases, to attract a lover with the allure of dried basil and mystery. And then, there were the astrologers, celestial speculators who insisted your spleen had a strong relationship with the planet Mars. They'd calculate your birth chart, your moon phase, and whether you were prone to Jupiter's melancholy or Saturn's flatulence. Prescriptions often included specific treatments to be administered beneath a waning moon while facing east and reciting the Lord's Prayer backward. It was medicine by stargazing, and completely ineffective. Unless you count giving people something beautiful to stare at while they coughed. So many strange remedies, and all administered with the crucial ingredient, conviction. Because if nothing else, medieval folk believed. They believed in the power of pigeon excrement, planetary influence, and haircuts as divine intervention. And as Oswin of Wimbledon could tell you, with his robust spleen and slightly singed eyelashes, sometimes belief is the greatest placebo of all. Now, let us slip quietly onwards, as the candle sputters low and the goats settle beneath the stars, to a practice nearly as odd as it is fragrant, where healing came not from herbs or prayer, but from the sweet, suspicious science of smells, in a quiet hamlet nestled somewhere between mud and more mud. A medieval physician, if one can so generously apply that title, leaned over a wooden table cluttered with leeches, garlic, and what might have once been a pigeon. His name was Sir Otwell, the cure certain, and he had never successfully cured anything except perhaps a patient's desire to see another doctor. It was the year 1342, a time when belief in humours was not a theory so much as an article of faith. Illness, they claimed, was the result of an imbalance in the bodily humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Colourful, yes. Sensible, less so. Poor Thomas the Miller had come to Otwell with a complaint of heaviness in the limbs and an unfortunate smattering of boils, which sounded less like a medical condition and more like a curse from a mildly irritated forest witch. Nevertheless, Otwell already had a solution prepared, still steaming gently in a clay cup, and smelling overwhelmingly of roasted onion and mild regret. "Drink this," he said, handing the dubious concoction to Thomas. "It'll drive the humours screaming from your body." Whether the humours screamed or simply filed a formal complaint remains unclear, but Thomas did, eventually, fall asleep, mostly from the trauma of the taste rather than any sedative effect. One common practice during this period was uroscopy, an art form that involved inspecting urine as though it were a fine vintage. Physicians would lift a flacon of golden liquid to the sunlight and gaze into it like it held the secrets of the cosmos. They'd observe the colour, clarity, and, on brave days, even take a gentle sniff. A good urine diagnosis hinged on extensive charts with shades ranging from pale dawnlight to murky troll soup. Otwell fancied himself a uroscopy savant. He had even fashioned his own urine wheel, much like a sommelier's aroma wheel, but with fewer grapes and more existential dread. If your urine was clear, you were suffering from over-chilling of the organs. If it was dark, your spleen is undoubtedly sulking. And if your sample had small floaty bits, a clear sign of having angered a minor saint. More optimistic sufferers often turned to the healing powers of gemstones. Amethysts, rubies, and sapphires were prescribed not for their aesthetic appeal, but for their deeply questionable medicinal properties. Scholars claimed that ruby would warm the body and protect against the vapors, an alarmingly vague threat, though surely something ghastly. Patients were advised to wear stones close to the skin, or better still, grind them into powder and mix them into wine. Nothing echoes medical confidence like drinking ground-up diamonds with your evening Cabernet. Sir Otwell's record with gemstone treatments was decidedly mixed. One lady of noble birth had taken powdered sapphire daily for hymnal hiccups, an ailment no one understood, but everyone agreed was terribly inconvenient at church. When the hiccup ceased, she declared the gem treatment a rousing success. Otwell, sensing this was more a miracle than science, added a 200% markup to his powdered gem menu and purchased a new plume for his cap. And then there was the matter of wound treatment. Medieval surgical hygiene operated on the principle of, let's just see what happens. The standard salve for an infected cut might include lard, cobwebs soaked in vinegar, and if Otwell was feeling fancy, dried moss, the colour of decisions one regrets. The notion of bacteria wouldn't exist for another 4 centuries. At this point in history, pain was proof it was working. Patients were also instructed to get lots of fresh air, which is less comforting when you consider hospitals were often placed outside city limits, not to embrace the open landscape, but to minimize the stench of suppurating plague boils. Of course, nothing rivals the medieval belief in the power of animal-based advice. Take, for example, the powdered dried toad applied to an incurable wart, or the use of mouse paste, a blessedly imprecise term, rubbed upon the gums of teething infants. And who could forget the ear infection remedy involving warm oil and half a roasted beetle? No word on whether the beetle had given informed consent. Yet through all this, Otwell was rarely out of work. His jar of leeches thrived. His urine wheel turned. Patients came hoping for relief and left with aromatic ointments, intricately tied talismans, and follow-up appointments. And under the flicker of a tallow candle, as Otwell jotted down another successful day in his ledger and nibbled gently on a candied almondine pebble, the world outside shifted imperceptibly toward enlightenment. But not just yet. Tomorrow would bring new ailments, old cures, and, for better or worse, a peculiar new theory about dreams, digestion, and the benefits of sleeping with one's feet pointing northwest, as the village rooster tucked his head under one wing, and even the stars seemed to stretch and yawn. The medieval townsfolk turned their thoughts, not to logic or evidence, but to the unmistakable science of leeches and astrology. Tonight, we drift gently into the peculiar world of humours. No, not humour as in hilarity, though the 14th century had its accidental moments of slapstick. No, the humours were the fluids believed to rule your body, your health, and, in some cases, your entire destiny, including whether you were violently sneezing because of the plague or simply because Venus was grumpy. There were 4 of these precious bodily fluids: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, collectively known as the 4 humours. According to medieval physicians, these governed not just your physical health, but also your personality. Too much black bile, you're melancholic. Tons of blood, you're a merry sanguine type, perhaps the kind who starts humming while butchering a goose for supper. The balance of humours was seen as delicate and easily upset, like a toddler holding an egg. A hot meal might tip the scales, while a sudden fright, a bad omen, or Jupiter moving into Sagittarius could destroy your entire equilibrium. Remedies range from the mildly inconvenient to the life-threatening, such as bloodletting, which involved relieving you of excess blood. An organ, surprisingly, they did not think vital to keeping you alive. Now, when someone had a headache, the culprit was often an overabundance of yellow bile, heated by the liver in a moment of spirited excess. The remedy, a purge, something to make the body, well, exit its contents from one end or the other. If that didn't settle the matter, then out came the leeches, or perhaps a bit of crushed emerald powder mixed with vinegar. It had absolutely no medical value, of course, but it sparkled, which helped distract both the patient and the physician from the utter lack of results. Interestingly, treatments were rarely just physical. Emotional and moral advice often came bundled with your bleeding. If your spleen was acting up, a visiting monk might suggest you stop telling lies or lusting after the neighbour's milkmaid. Your inner filth was always accompanied by some form of spiritual gunk. The two, they believed, were as entangled as a peasant's sock and a bramble bush. To keep humours in check, medieval folk were obsessed with regulating the 6 non-naturals, which sounds like a medieval boy band, but tragically isn't. These were air, food and drink, sleep and wakefulness, motion and rest, excretions and, get ready, the passions of the soul. You weren't just advised what to eat, but when, where and with what kind of mood. Eating while angry, for example, might inflame your bile. Eating while laughing, that might provoke phlegm. Eating while questioning what on earth this advice even meant. Dangerous territory indeed. This led to delightfully circuitous medical advice, such as avoid garlic while sad, lest your insides curdle like spoiled milk. Or this gem from a 13th century text: one should not bathe during thunder, for it vexes the lungs and startles the spleen. And then there were urine charts. Yes, urine. The medieval diagnostic champion. Doctors carried ornately illustrated charts comparing the colour and texture of your personal golden stream to a bewildering variety of shades, from pale straw to red wine. They sniffed it, swirled it, and even whispered sweet nothings to it, supposedly to coax it into revealing what your liver had for lunch. In extreme cases, they'd look to the stars and divine your kidney function based on planetary alignment. It would be easy now to scoff. But there's an endearing earnestness in it all. The attempt to understand the vast mysteries of the body with only a candle, a brass pot, and a theory that your brain was cooled by mucus, bless them, but confidently wrong, which counts for something in the annals of human optimism. And so, we ease back into the soft moss of medieval nighttime, where the air carries the scent of herbs, chamber pots, and vague medical dread. Let your humours rest gently, your bile simmer softly, and your brain, mercifully free of leeches for the time being, drift onward toward a most curious method of medieval detox. A quiet wind rustles through the thatched roofs and cabbage gardens of a small medieval hamlet, where evening settles like dust upon woolen cloaks and weary bones. And somewhere between the grinding of a mill wheel and the clink of a blacksmith's tongs, our focus softens, tilting gently toward a peculiar little figure. A medieval housewife hunched studiously over a steaming cauldron, muttering the word urine with the reverence of a pharmacist reciting a prayer. Yes, tonight we enter the fragrant world of medieval urine therapy, an actual thing, much beloved, disconcertingly popular. Picture it, a world where public health and personal dignity were less of a priority and more of a whimsical suggestion. And in this bubbling stew of superstition and rudimentary curiosity, human urine became something of a Swiss Army cure-all, from eye drops to toothache remedies to, alarmingly, a reliable diagnostic tool used by medieval doctors who really liked staring at flasks of golden liquid. Through squinted eyes and furrowed brows, they would declare, with divine confidence, "Ah, yes, the yellowish tint and slight cloudiness. You are suffering from excess choler and also possibly a sprained soul." Urine was believed to contain critical messages from the body, and doctors practicing the noble art of uroscopy often carried a urine wheel, essentially a color chart for interpreting toxins, humors, and once in a while, the health of your immortal soul. And if you're wondering how one's bladder output was transformed into public performance, allow me to introduce the ceremonial urine flask. Glass, bulbous, cherished. Medieval physicians, especially those trying their best to look smart while charging a month's worth of turnip money, would swirl it around like a fine wine and muse over its bouquet. Sip? Of course not. Sniff? Allegedly. But rest assured, the patient's dignity was mostly preserved, assuming they didn't mind carrying their own sample across town in what one manuscript lovingly called a warm satchel. And truly, what was urine not used for? It was applied to wounds, used to clean laundry, and in one particularly spirited stretch of 14th century desperation, recommended as a way to combat plague. The advice was simple: drink it, daily, yours or someone else's. The choice was yours, though it probably made dinner parties slightly awkward. There is something delightfully backwards about a time when a person's witchcraft trial might depend on the colour of their pee. And yet, uroscopy was serious business, performed by learned men in long robes who would nod sagely, as if deciphering an ancient script, while your chamber pot sat nervously on the examination table like a golden snitch of destiny. Moving from medicine to household utility, urine's uses were almost offensively wide-ranging. It was collected in vast communal jars and left to ferment into something ominously called lant, which was then used for everything from cleaning wool to tanning leather. Envision, if you will, an entire street reeking of ammonia, women elbow deep in the stuff, exclaiming, "Well, it gets the bloodstains out." Which frankly, it did. Some methods work. They don't pass the sniff test, but they work. And during times of war, or just regional civilized quarreling, urine was even used as a primitive gunpowder ingredient. Not because it's inherently explosive, but because saltpeter a key component, could be extracted from especially well-matured urine-soaked straw. So it's entirely possible that a particularly heroic military victory somewhere in the medieval timeline was only possible thanks to a rather brave man who volunteered his privy. We laugh because it all seems so backwards, but medieval people were not trying to be absurd. They were doing their best with what they had. 4 bodily humours, innumerable saints, and that enduring human desire to find patterns, to explain symptoms, and to feel like we might actually understand the strange, leaking vessels we all call home, as the candles burn low in that distant physician's hut, and the flask of golden mystery is gently set down for the evening. We too shall set aside this peculiar potion, letting our thoughts trickle softly into silence. Tomorrow, we may explore remedies we can't unsee, but for now, let's gently close the curtain on this curious chapter and drift toward dreams where no one is swirling anything in a flask. And there he stood, barefoot in the moonlight, holding a baked hedgehog covered in vinegar. "It's for my liver," he said. You see, in medieval Europe, approximately 6 out of every 5 people thought that the stranger something tasted, the more medicinal it probably was. The 14th century physician's toolkit was less pills and stethoscopes, more boiled frogs and whispered prayers. By today's standards, their remedies range from the merely eccentric to the absolutely catastrophic. But in their hearts, they truly believed that whatever didn't cure you just needed more garlic. Now, if your belly felt unwell, and it often did, considering the medieval diet consisted heavily of mystery meats, trenchers soaked in beer, and eternal friendship with intestinal parasites, you might be instructed to sleep with your head facing the east. Apparently, east was where health lived. West was where death's draught came from. North was frequently just cold and damp. And south, nobody trusted the south, but directional sleeping was only the beginning. A common prescription for indigestion, according to the learned minds of the age, involved tying a dried eel around your neck and humming hymns backwards. If the eel slipped off, it meant the devil had given up and gone elsewhere. The eel, somehow, was less regrettable than the feces-based pharmaceuticals. Oh yes, brace yourself gently, dear listener, for a favorite salve among certain monastic healers was a soothing mixture of rosewater, crushed pearls, and dog dung. Not just any dog dung. It had to be from a spotted dog collected at dawn while fasting. Because if you were going to smear excrement on your skin, it might as well be ritually correct. Then of course, we find the noble leech, a creature that probably should have unionized given how overworked it was. Leeches were the door-to-door salesmen of medieval medicine, over-relied upon, endlessly circulating, and seldom yielding satisfying results. You had a headache, leeches, achy knees, more leeches, sad about your crops, again. Leeches, possibly combined with chanting and a sprinkle of powdered unicorn horn, which was rarely actually unicorn, though often reliably powdered. And what about women? Ah, yes. For those of the fairer sex suffering from womb wandering, a dangerous diagnosis when femininity was considered a sort of minor sorcery. The answer was scented smoke. Doctors, using a logic that still baffles modern scholars and their cats, believed that the uterus could roam freely about a woman's body like a balloon in mild weather. If it floated too high, melancholy, too low, madness. The cure, wafting fragrant herbs beneath the hem and foul-smelling ones by the nose, to motivate the uterus to return to its modest little spot, like coaxing a shy cat out from under the bed using a tuna sandwich and shame. Many of these ideas stemmed from humoral theory, the notion that your body was a bubbling stew of 4 fluids, blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. The healthy body, they believed, was a perfectly balanced example of this rather unappetizing soup. Get too mopey after a rainy day. Your black bile was probably high, likely caused by staring mournfully at the sky. Treatment: warm wine, mild poetry, and the occasional application of crushed beetles. Of course, no discussion of medieval health would be complete without the ever-fashionable practice of trepanation. This, for the uninitiated or somehow blissfully unaware, involved drilling a small hole in your skull to release bad spirits, or more tangibly, intense pressure from a head injury. While it sounds utterly alarming, some folks even survived. Skulls mended beneath caps of wool and prayers. Others, well, their spirits were released more permanently. Still, it's worth remembering, under the candle's flicker of ridicule, that they were trying. These people were doing their very best with what little they had: faith, herbs, a seasonally dependable goat. Illness was invisible, infection was mysterious, and bacteria wouldn't get press until centuries later. In the absence of knowledge, humans built towers of guesses, stitched together with folklore and held up with superstition. And though most of those towers have since crumbled, taking the eel necklaces and womb-herding aromas with them, they remain oddly poetic, frighteningly fragrant, sometimes fatal, but poetic. Now rest easy, traveller of time, as the mists begin to swirl again. When next we drift into the velvety shadows of history, we'll tiptoe into a chapter where royal hygiene held court, and even kings had secrets better left unwashed. As the candle of reason flickered gently in the drafty chambers of medieval medicine, one particularly peculiar ember glowed stubbornly in the corner. The practice of using gemstones to cure, well, nearly everything. From headaches to infertility, convulsions to belly aches, there was a gem for every affliction, provided you could convince someone to part with their emeralds or not ask too many questions about the suspiciously dull sapphire hanging around your neck. You see, in the minds of many medieval physicians and alchemists, amateur astrologists, and conveniently wealthy merchants, gems weren't just sparkly accessories. They were, allegedly, tiny cosmic batteries charged by the stars, humming with healing energies and ancient wisdom. A diamond didn't just gleam, it clarified the mind. A ruby wasn't merely red, it stoked the fires of the body, rousing sluggish blood and even, some claimed, one's more amorous urges. Naturally, there was a methodology to all this madness. For example, one was not to simply wear a garnet willy-nilly. No. The gem had to be set in gold, ideally consecrated by a priest on a Thursday, and worn on a chain of silk dyed blue. Because, of course, red gems gain power from the contrast, or something. The logic often wandered off mid-sentence and returned hours later with a completely different argument. The medieval text, Lapidario del Rey Don Alfonso, written in the 13th century under the patronage of King Alfonso VI of Castile, also delightfully known as Alfonso the Wise because every dinner party needs one, listed scores of stones and their therapeutic properties. It recommended, for instance, holding a topaz in your mouth to cure madness. That's sweet, until you consider the choking hazards. Amethysts, meanwhile, were prized for their sobering abilities. Warriors and wine enthusiasts alike took to tying them to their cups, believing the lilac jewel could prevent drunkenness. Imagine a medieval frat house, each tankard jangling with semi-precious optimism as everyone steadily ignored their blurred vision and growing belligerence. Then there was the opal, considered a miracle gem. It was thought to contain the virtues of all other stones, and thus could allegedly repel lightning, detect poisons, and even make the wearer invisible. Yes, invisible. Though there is, lamentably, no record of any opal-wielding escapologists making a successful career in medieval stage magic. Some physicians took their gem prescriptions even further by administering them internally. Yes, internally. Ground into a fine and expensive powder, precious stones were sometimes brewed into tonics and elixirs. Swallowing rubies may not have actually extended anyone's life, but it certainly shortened the lifespan of their coin purse. Curiously, pearls were especially beloved in this gulp-worthy category. Crushed pearls mixed with honey were recommended for heart ailments, coughs, and even melancholia. Whether it soothed the soul or just distracted it with the taste of gritty sea treasure, we may never know. Apothecaries carried these concoctions next to dried beetles. Mummy powder, yes, that's exactly what it sounds like. And a variety of herbal brews that mostly tasted like regrets and wood shavings. If you're wondering whether all this had any effect, well, in a roundabout way, yes. Many believed it worked, and when you're desperately hopeful and consistently dazzled by the shimmer of a sapphire tied to your wrist, those positive vibes can go a long way. They probably didn't actually mend fractures or cure leprosy, but they did make the patient feel noticed, pampered, and extravagantly bedazzled, which in a time when most medical treatments involved alarming smells and public leechings was a pretty good deal. Of course, medieval doctors contrasted these shiny approaches with the era's firm belief in humours, those bodily fluids with emotional personalities. So if your yellow bile was in a temper and gemstones failed to pacify it, someone might declare it time to place you under a lunar eclipse with a tourmaline on your tongue, surrounded by goat hair and good intentions. Oddly enough, by the late Middle Ages, the Church began to frown upon such gemstone antics. Some saw it as dangerously close to sorcery, presumably because nothing says demonic influence like a blue rock glued to your forehead during a fever, dream. And yet, even as polished stones faded from the elite's medicine drawer, the tradition seeped into the folk practices of Europe for centuries, turning village healers into portable jewelry shops with opinions. As moonlight spills over weathered stone windowsills and the stars above resemble so many scattered diamonds, one begins to understand the longing behind it all. A desire to touch something eternal, to cradle beauty close to the skin and call it healing. But if you think stones had all the answers, just wait until someone suggests treating your ailments with bread. Yes, stale bread. Not for eating, for science. Let's drift there next, shall we? Somewhere around the year 1337, a year that sounds oddly like a gamer's screen name but was, in fact, squarely medieval. Europeans developed a sudden fascination with urine, not as something to flush and forget, indoor plumbing being centuries away from its triumphant debut, but as a miraculous golden window into human health. Yes, our ancestors took one curious look into their chamber pots and thought, this seems diagnostic. Welcome to the poetic world of uroscopy, the medieval art of inspecting one's pee for signs of calamity, destiny, and possibly a midlife crisis. Physicians, who often had less training than your average bartender today, would hold up a bulbous flask of urine to the light like a sommelier appraising a questionable vintage. Colour, clarity, smell, even the presence of unfortunate little floaties, all were believed to reveal secrets about the liver, the spleen, the soul, perhaps even the weather. Imagine this: you're wealthy, reasonably noble, and you've just been seized by a mysterious malaise, most likely indigestion. though you did eat fish pie that had been out on the table since Sunday. You summon a learned doctor, and into your solar strides a man in robes the colour of horseradish, wielding a glass bottle like a sacred relic. With great ceremony, he swirls your sample beneath his nose, pauses thoughtfully, and declares, with Karen-like gravitas, "Ah, the urine is pale with hints of cloudiness. A melancholy distemper, no doubt. We must apply leeches at once." Uroscopy had its own reference charts, parchment scrolls adorned with rainbow wheels of urine hues, like a painter's guide gone terribly off the rails. Deep red, too much bile, bright yellow. That's just fine. Brown black, you might already be partially a ghost. Modern science, bless its spreadsheets, has determined that medieval urine analysis was, well, let's say imaginative. But that didn't stop it from being wildly popular. Medical students trained in the art of pee reading the same way wizards study stars or toddlers assess mud puddles, with serious eyebrows and wild enthusiasm. In fact, it became so respected that by the late 14th century, physicians were travelling with purpose-built glass flasks called maculae, each one carefully shaped to magnify any errant shimmer or troubling swirl. There were even instances of prophetic urine. Chronicles tell of one rather distressed abbot who, upon seeing the eerie green hue of his chambermaid sample, declared that the devil had taken residence in her left kidney. A week later, she sneezed blood and was promptly considered a miracle, or a witch, depending on the angle of the wind. The obsession didn't stop at hospitals. Average folks developed home remedies based on what their pee was whispering to them that week. Feeling sluggish? Try rhubarb. Cloudy urine? Must be ghost vapors. Best to sleep with rosemary under your pillow and chew fennel seeds before breakfast. Did these work? Statistically unlikely, but they were comforting, like herbal horoscopes for your bladder. Lest you think all this was entirely foolish, uroscopy did sometimes get a few things unintentionally right. Certain conditions, like uncontrolled diabetes, do affect the smell and colour of urine. A sweet aroma might truly mean something was amiss. Though, in medieval times, noticing a sugary scent usually led to a suggestion of being possessed by sugar demons or a recommendation to eat more pickled eel. As night unfurls its navy blue blanket outside, one imagines a small country cottage where a sleep-hatted peasant squints by candlelight into a wooden bowl. They murmur, scratching their thatch of greying hair. Looks like we've got ourselves a bilious temper today. And with that dignified diagnosis, they bundle up with some thyme tea and clutch a turnip in spiritual solidarity. Ah, the world was strange, dear listener, and yet not entirely unfamiliar. Even today, we fixate on bodily signals that speak in symptoms and metaphors. The lesson, possibly, is that humans have always looked within for answers, sometimes too literally. And tomorrow? Well, tomorrow we'll take a gentle stroll through the curious world of medieval dental care, where clean teeth were a luxury, a rarity, and sometimes achieved using a paste of sage, crushed pearls, and ground up burnt mice. But that's a sleepy horror for another time. For now, let your thoughts float like tiny herbal remedies on a ripple of warm tea. Once upon a very scratchy time, deep in the cobblestone heart of the Middle Ages, lice weren't only fashionable, they were practically considered roommates. Entire communities lived in harmony with an invisible folk symphony of parasitic personal life choices. Picture a feudal lord striding proudly through his hall, beard majestic, armour gleaming, and his scalp hosting a medieval rave he never paid rent for. Cleanliness you see, was a deeply suspicious activity. Bathing was widely considered dangerous, something akin to opening one's soul to cunning, invisible spirits. If warm water touched skin too often, it was feared the body's natural defenses would be weakened and illnesses would sneak in through your damp pores like outlaws through a secret tunnel. So many people opted to simply not bathe at all, for months on end. Monks and scholars debated this extensively. Some suggested a monthly scrub if you were particularly sinful, a seasonal rinse if you were really pushing it. But most people turned to other solutions, namely perfumes, powders, and layers upon layers of increasingly aromatic clothing. In fact, many medieval health recipes involved what we today might call aggressive masking. If you wanted to freshen up, you might sprinkle crushed violets onto your undergarments, or dry rose petals, or in particularly pungent months, a little blend of civet musk and dried rosemary, which only sounds romantic if you've never smelled actual civet musk. Spoiler, it's extracted from the rear end of a small ferret-like creature, and it's about as charming as one might imagine. In cities, the scent situation scaled accordingly. Urban centres like Paris and London weren't just teeming with people. They were also bravely inventing whole new categories of stench. Chamber pots emptied from windows, tanners boiling animal hides near bakeries, and fishmongers diligently not refrigerating anything. It was like a musical of smells, featuring all your unused compost streams and performed nightly. Naturally, the question arose, how does one stay healthy in such fragrant circumstances? The answer, according to medieval medical wisdom, wear a beak. Yes, the plague doctor mask. That now iconic bird-like visage made famous for looking like a haunted carnival duck. Those masks were more than just theatre. Doctors would stuff the beak full of herbs, flowers, and occasionally vinegar-soaked sponges. The belief was simple: keep foul smells away, because bad smells were thought to be the root of illness. A theory known as miasma. So if people were dropping like flies around you, it wasn't the actual flies. It was the unfortunate air they travelled in. Some beak recipes were quite elaborate. Juniper berries, cloves, mint leaves, and occasionally a small onion for character. The result? A walking salad bar swooping through a hospital ward. Back in the villages, the less bird-like but equally imaginative folk also had their treatments for keeping illness at bay. One popular remedy involved hanging a dead mole around your neck as protection against fevers. Others swore by carrying a pouch of crushed emeralds. Expensive, not terribly effective, but undeniably stylish. And if you really wanted to impress your local apothecary, you might brew a tonic involving unicorn horn shavings. Of course, unicorns were famously elusive, so most of those shavings were actually powdered narwhal tusk or ground stag horn, depending on who your snake oil supplier was. Meanwhile, if a child was suffering from teething pain, it was sometimes recommended to rub their gums with hare's brain, boiled in mother's milk. A delicate, floppy-eared blend of confusion and sorcery, no doubt. But perhaps the oddest of all hygiene-adjacent practices was the medieval idea of balancing your humours. Those four mysterious bodily liquids thought to govern everything from mood swings to baldness. Bathing too often might increase phlegm or throw off your black bile, and no one wants a surplus of melancholy-producing juices. So instead of bathing, many opted for dry washing, rubbing the skin with linen cloths, or brushing the hair with sweet-smelling powders made of rose petals, cinnamon, and sometimes breadcrumbs. Just imagine being exfoliated with breakfast, a scented crouton massage, if you will. Did it work? Well, define work. People still fell ill in droves, but they often passed with dignity and at least a hint of time behind the ears. And so, the scent of medieval healthcare drifted gently into history. A bouquet of flowers, fermentation, and fortified guesses. But the story doesn't end here. There are more. Curious concoctions and curious cures, just a candle flicker away. Now drift with me toward a curious corner of medieval medicine where health advice took an unexpected detour. Straight into your pocket, or rather, your purse made of leather and hope, because we're talking about medieval amulets. Those quaint little objects of protection and, allegedly, well-being, blessed with mystery and a profound misunderstanding of biology. You see, in the Middle Ages, before the invention of antiseptics, thermometers, or the modern concept of germs, people naturally turned to what they had: superstition, saints, and small shiny things. Having a headache, hang an amulet carved with Latin that no one actually understood. Tummy ache, press an herb-stuffed pouch against your skin and wait patiently for magic to do its thing. Toothache? Oh, that one's easy. Carry a beaver's tooth around your neck. Why? Because beavers gnaw on wood, and in the inexplicable logic of the time, this vowed tooth was said to ease the gnawing pain. Somewhere, an actual beaver is still laughing. One particularly delightful form of medieval prophylactic was the so-called abracadabra triangle. Yes, the very word modern stage magicians shout while pulling rabbits from hats. But long before its glitzy Vegas career, abracadabra was part of a medicinal charm. Medieval folks believed that writing the word in the shape of a decreasing triangle, with one fewer letter on each line, would suck disease right out of the body, sort of like a reverse alphabet for bad vibes. The finished result looked like an increasingly confused spelling bee, and they wore it around their neck or tucked it under a pillow. If the illness didn't retreat out of awe, perhaps it fled from bewilderment. Take, for instance, the ever-dreaded plague. Faced with pustules, fever, and the general tendency to drop dead, people wore amulets filled with dried toads, crushed emeralds, and the ashes of burnt scripture. Because if the disease didn't get you, the expense might. Emeralds, you see, were marvelously believed to sweat in the presence of poison. A very dramatic response for a rock, but we've all overreacted once or twice. Some went further and carved amulets with the names of angels, not your cherubic, harp-strumming variety, but the obscure, multi-syllabic angels that sounded like someone sneezed into a typewriter. Names like Barakiel or Jehudiel. Supposedly, wearing these would grant divine protection, or at the very least, confuse any demon that tried to check in on your vitals. Animals often found themselves pulled into this charmed world, somewhat unwillingly. The powdered horn of a unicorn, which was in fact just a narwhal tusk marked up dramatically by opportunistic traders, was ground up and sold as a luxurious cure-all, able to cleanse poisons or ward off gout. That it didn't actually work was beside the point. It gave the nobility something to sprinkle on their gruel and feel fancy about. Perhaps the most endearing of all talismans, though, was the humble mole's foot. Yes, a literal furry, shriveled mole foot, carried not as a fashion statement, but to cure cramps and pains of mysterious origin. The reasoning? Moles dig, and pain needs to be dug out. Not flawed logic exactly, just creatively analogical. Besides, you have to admire the determination of someone whispering to a mole's foot at 2 a.m, asking it to please remove their arthritis. Now, to be gentle and fair to our medieval ancestors, they weren't entirely irrational. Often amulets were filled with herbs thought to have medicinal properties: sage, rue, wormwood. Though the delivery system of tie it around your waist and hope left something to be desired. Still, in a world rich with mystery and poor in penicillin, people clung to hope wherever they could find it, in talismans, in prayers, and in the quiet rustle of parchment scrawled with sacred words. So tonight, picture a weary traveller from the 14th century, trudging through mud and moss, clutching a leather bag filled with charms tied to ancient beliefs, a pebble carved with a Celtic knot, a dried beetle wrapped in silk, and perhaps someone's hair sewn into linen, all pulsing silently with hopeful enchantment. Whatever their flaws, these charms were more than superstition. They were comfort made portable. And as this traveller pauses under an ivy-covered tree, stars pricking the velvety black of a medieval sky, their charms dangle softly in the moonlight. Unwitting ancestors to the vitamin gummies in your pantry drawer. Now, with your thoughts gently wrapped in old scrolls and superstition, let's turn the page on another curious custom. One that involves laughter, illness, and possibly a roasted hedgehog. Ah, the joys of medieval hygiene. Those tender centuries when bathing too often was thought to incite dangerous passions, and teeth were best left to fall out naturally, like overripe apples from an indifferent tree. But among the most delightfully curious customs of medieval health practice was the age-old belief in something known as urine divination. Yes, we're about to spend a little quiet time in the strange and golden-hued world of uroscopy. I assure you, it's just as charming and unsettling as it sounds. You see, in a world devoid of microscopes, blood tests, or even modest respect for personal space, a physician's best diagnostic tool was a humble flask of, well, your number one, preferably freshly bottled. Ostentatiously yellow, held with a scholarly squint up to the soft afternoon light, your golden stream was regarded not just as waste, but as a whisper from the soul, sort of like a murky internal crystal ball. Doctors, more accurately called physicians, if they had been to a university, or quacks if they hadn't, would carry around ornately painted charts of urine colours, chartreuse to walnut, pineapple to port wine. These hues matched conveniently odd descriptions like wine dark, cloudy with floating specks, or the more whimsically alarming mildewed barley water. Oh yes, your bladder's finest offering could reveal everything apparently, from a troublesome hot liver to a melancholic spleen. One medieval uroscopist, even now an elegantly absurd word, insisted that green urine was a sign of madness, while brown was probably a sign of death, either impending or already underway. These judgments were made soberly, even nobly, and often while peering into the flask on an empty stomach. And so, like modern connoisseurs swirling a fine burgundy, medieval urine inspectors would gently twist the flask, sniff contemplatively, and sometimes warm it by candlelight for better clarity. Some travelled with a full urine wheel, a sort of Renaissance mood ring, but for kidney output. This practice became so entrenched that even when a physician couldn't visit a patient in person, concerned relatives would send the next best thing, a courier carrying a sloshing flask of their loved one's best stream. These travelling urinals, yes, that's what they called them, were dutifully presented to physicians in distant villages who, in the grand tradition of long-distance guesswork, would study the specimen and recommend a poultice, prayer, or a change in planetary alignment. Storage might also become a concern. Wealthy homes sometimes had a little shelf near the hearth, not for spices or sacred texts, but for cooling jars of last week's urine, just in case the doctor needed to review the full historical progression. Ah yes, the physician might say. On Monday, the urine was turbulent and bilious. On Thursday, it was peevish and ambitious. We are firmly entering the choleric phase now. In the face of all this leashless logic, one cannot help but admire the commitment. After all, uroscopy manuals, some elaborately illuminated with diagrams and golden peas shimmering on vellum, were considered elite texts. Medical students would swear solemn oaths upon them. The full name for the art was De Orinis, which, if we're being linguistically honest, really should have been translated today into on things that shouldn't be in glass flasks. What makes all of this so remarkable, aside of course from the complete absence of privacy, is that this method of diagnosis was considered high science. Monasteries trained monks in the principles of uroscopy without a hint of blush. Medieval Paris even had guilds regulating the practice, which suggests that someone, somewhere, was knighted for being especially good at squinting into someone's bodily lemonade. Despite its peculiarities, uroscopy wasn't entirely nonsense. Changes in colour and clarity do, in fact, signal health issues. It's just that, in the absence of germs, scans, or quite frankly, science, medieval doctors had little else to go on. So they did the best they could. And if their method involved warm jars of deeply personal liquid being mailed around the continent, placed on family mantles, and consulted as if they were horoscopes, well, one could argue it's no more odd than today's obsession with online symptom checkers and crystal-charged wellness water. With the candle light flickering over those ancient flasks, and a breeze whispering through the unglazed window of a village apothecary, the world, though less sterile, was no less earnest in its search for health. And in strange little ways, it was maybe even more poetic. Let us now turn our gaze away from the wobbling jars and gentle golden arches of medieval medicine and wander towards something even more peculiar. What happened when health advice started involving toads? And, strangely enough, cheese. The moonlight, in some forgotten century, may have once glistened off the polished brass of a barber's basin. Not because the basin was being used for shaving, mind you, but because someone had diagnosed it as an ideal cranial realignment device. Tonight, we find our drowsy curiosities wandering into one of the medieval world's more buffoonishly sincere medical traditions, trepanation. Yes, dear dreamer, drilling holes into one's skull. Not as a punishment, but as a cure. Somehow, in the shadowy folds of medieval Europe's slow-burning wisdom, there existed a popular belief that opening the head was a quick fix for everything from epilepsy to persistent sadness to oddly excessive thinking. Imagine, if you will, a quiet village square around the year 1237. A man in a faded wool tunic strolls up to a local surgeon, a fellow whose qualifications include owning a sharp object and very little fear, and says something like, "My lord, I've been troubled by dark humours and horrid winds in the brain." And the surgeon, stroking his greasy beard thoughtfully, replies, "Aha, that'll be a spirit trapped in the skull. We must let it out." And so, out came the tools. A small pick, possibly a mallet. The surgical table was often a kitchen chair, anaesthetic, occasionally a draught of wine, if you were fancy. If not, you got a stick to bite and an encouraging pat on the shoulder. Now, to our modern ears, it all sounds like the worst possible DIY project. But in that strange, scroll-lit age, it made an odd kind of sense. You see, the human humours, blood, black bile, yellow bile, and phlegm, were believed to be in delicate balance. When they wobbled, as with all things in medieval medicine, the solution was to unload something. Excess blood, bleed it out with leeches, mysterious head troubles, puncture the pressure valve. One of the more famous medieval manuals, the Chirurgia by Guy de Chauliac, offered elaborate instructions on how to responsibly burr a hole into a person's scalp. Remarkably detailed, lovingly diagrammed, and handwritten by candlelight, as if the act of boring into someone's skull was just a slightly difficult casserole recipe. Apply pressure firmly, lest the instrument slip, for that endangers the brain, he cautions, as if the difficulty lies not in the skull hole, but in your grip strength. And yet, trepanation occasionally worked. Not because releasing demons is a sound medical plan, but because people often survived the procedure, possibly relieved by the placebo effect, or by the simple fact that the cause of their discomfort, like cranial swelling, was incidentally addressed. The body is endlessly mysterious, and sometimes even a wildly bad idea might flirt with usefulness. Still, we must imagine the neighbors whispering, "Martha, do you see Henry lately? Had his skull done. Looks lively now. Can recite 3 psalms without blinking." How proud they must have been. Of course, most people didn't suffer such surgeries unless they were nobly important, terribly desperate, or just had unhelpfully adventurous friends. In time, trepanation faded out of popularity, and with good reason. The germ theory of disease gave bad ideas a much-needed retirement plan, but not before it carved out its curious place among medieval cures. Skull boring, spiritual venting, and humoral balancing were all stitched together into a tapestry of baffled but heartfelt medicine. And really, that's what medieval healthcare often was. A deeply sincere attempt to do the right thing, while knowing almost none of the right things. So lie back now, snug in your blanket fortress, and imagine that rickety surgeon's shack, echoing with medieval mutterings about wind escaping the brain and spirits made drowsy by fresh air. It was a world where every bump, sneeze, or bout of waffle-headed confusion might demand a wholly unexpected remedy, and where, of all things, your best hope for clarity might involve a hammer and a prayer, but as pleasant, dreams pressed gently at your temples, metaphorically, rest assured. We'll drift now to another oddity, one involving frogs, fumes, and, curiously, footwear. The medieval mind, ever inventive and occasionally a touch too enthusiastic, had a particular gift for noticing a problem and confidently marching off in the opposite direction to fix it. Take, for example, the issue of insomnia, a timeless affliction. Today we might reach for herbal tea, deep breathing, or that guided meditation app featuring forest noises, and a man named Marcus with a voice smoother than velvet on goat butter. But in the 14th century, sleeplessness was attacked with far more ambition and significantly more pigeon feathers. Physicians of old, clad in scholarly robes and surrounded by scrolls with fractal marginal doodlings, had an assortment of suggestions for bringing about rest. One such gem involved placing a warm brick, freshly baked by the fire, upon the stomach of the sleepless. This was believed to realign the humours, a sort of precarious bodily soup of bile, blood, and melancholy that apparently enjoyed misbehaving at bedtime. The warm brick was not only practical, heating-wise, it was also symbolically calming. Bricks don't panic after all. Alternatively, if warmth didn't woo you into slumber, sleep doctors, a phrase that meant something very different then, might recommend the wearing of a nightcap soaked in rose water and vinegar. Decorative yet damp, it was said to cool the brain. something a good medieval nap supposedly required. This belief in chilled cerebrums runs deep, fueled by Galenic theories that imagine the head as a kind of overheated oven in need of ventilation and perfumed herbs. Imagine curling up, not under a wool quilt, but with a wet onion poultice wrapped around your forehead, and you begin to get the idea. Of course, the stars themselves were consulted. Not actual astronomers, no, but learned astrologers who consulted planetary alignments for the ideal moments to do anything really, from sneezing to tooth extraction. Certain times were deemed unlucky for sleep, so if you were lying awake on a Tuesday night with Venus in a bad mood and Saturn sulking in the east, you were simply out of luck. Better wait for Wednesday, they might say, and in the meantime, try not to dream. Herbs also played their part, in that charmingly medieval way where half the advice was probably dreamed up during a rosemary-induced hallucination. Valerian root was quite popular, not only as a mild sedative, but also for its rather notable smell, which may have driven away not only wakefulness, but also small animals, errant spirits, and house guests. Poppy seeds were used too, but with the warning to avoid them on feast days, lest one become slothful in both body and soul. Guilt, it turns out, was not a friend to restful sleep. Oddly, several sources also speak highly of placing certain objects beneath one's pillow to invite sleep. These range from bits of wolf fur to absorb nightmares, supposedly, to slices of buttered bread, possibly to confuse witches. But perhaps the oddest of all was an Elizabethan recommendation to sleep with a live eel in your bed. Where you placed it was left, to some relief, ambiguous. The theory was that its slick serpentine nature would prevent evil from resting in your bed with you. Modern bedding arrangements tend to exclude eels, but who've we to judge what once passed for a cuddle buddy? Still, among all this nightly nonsense, my personal favorite might be the medieval handbook that declared the key to good sleep was to wash one's feet, empty one's bowels, and read a story of saints or noble deeds before laying upon the left side. In that simple trio, clean feet, clear conscience, and heroic bedtime reading, there is, unexpectedly, a gentle kind of wisdom, a medieval whisper across centuries that suggests maybe, even when we're wrong, we're earnestly trying. So, as the candlelight dips low and the breeze carries the scent of distant hayfields, let us leave our medieval sleeper lying peacefully, brick on belly, nightcap soggily drooping, perhaps dreaming of dragon-slaying saints, and speaking of things oddly applied to the human body in the name of health. Let's drift now toward the curious case of powdered unicorn horn. Yes, that happened. Like any good medieval knight, this tale begins not with a dragon or a damsel, but with a sheep's bladder. Yes, a sheep's bladder. You see, in the glowing candle-lit gloom of 14th century Europe, an entire field of urine diagnostics flourished with such flair that you'd think they'd invented science. These early physicians, known as uromancers, no, not wizards of peeing, though it does sound like they might be, relied on a rather golden method of assessing your health by examining your bodily fluids in a clear glass flask, preferably held up against the sun like a contemplative wine steward who's had a very strange day. Was your urine cloudy? Danger. Too yellow? Probably the plague. Red tinged? Oh dear. Better start making peace with your neighbours. Green? Well, now we've entered uncharted emerald territory. To make this time-honoured and vaguely alarming judgment, medieval doctors would consult elaborate colour charts, kind of like a painter's swatch for pee. These uroscopic wheels were detailed diagrams with colours ranging from sunny amber to watery death. often accompanied by captions that read more like apocalyptic horoscopes than anything the CDC would endorse. Of course, the average patient didn't mind. That's if they were even conscious. And the doctor certainly seemed confident, squinting sagely at the flask like Hamlet pondering Yorick's skull. Except instead of a skull, you were presenting them with Tuesday's tea, steeped in all the wrong herbs. It didn't stop there. Many medieval towns had these self-declared doctors who took great pride in their collection of old bladders and glass flasks. Some even made house calls, carrying satchels that clinked with the telltale sound of fluid analysis on the go. The medieval version of Uber Health, but with a hint more sheep. Naturally, this practice led to strange consequences. For one, privacy was optional. If you thought modern checkups were invasive, imagine bringing a bottle of your personal liquid to market and discussing its hue with a man who looked like he hadn't bathed since the last eclipse. But then, nothing about hygiene was quite what we'd call rigorous. Within this grand urological tradition, there was a particular belief that really gallops gloriously off the cliff of reason. It was the notion that the moon could, quite literally, sour your urine. That's right, a full moon, with its whimsical silvery light and romantic influence over poets and werewolves, was apparently also in the business of upsetting your bladder chemistry. One cleric even suggested that if someone were to relieve themselves under moonlight, the humours within could become corrupted by celestial vapours. Imagine trying to explain that to your neighbours. No, Gertrude, I didn't sleepwalk across your tulip patch. The moon made me ferment. Still, not all pea-based medicine was outrageous. Some physicians, genuinely ahead of their time, were noting patterns of dehydration, jaundice, even diabetes through urinalysis, though the taste test for sugar content is best left unmentioned. Yes, some doctors tasted their patients' urine, and if that doesn't send you sprinting toward herbal tea and a polite society, I'm not sure what will. Even the great Hippocrates, whose name we often shout when pretending we're fancier than we are, wrote extensively on urine as a diagnostic tool. But while he aimed for rational observations, the medieval version escalated into something more akin to mystical potion reading, peomancy, if you will, and, as one might expect, medieval innovators couldn't help but invent accessories to enhance this art form. Portable urine viewers lined with ivory and brass, detailed guides printed on parchment with grand illustrations of flasks, bodily organs, and unhelpful Latin phrases like super urinum est veritas. Translation: in the P lies truth. A bold slogan, one must admit. So next time you glance at a clear amber tea or step into the moonlight to wonder if you're aligned with the stars, remember this. Somewhere in medieval Europe, a man with day-old soup on his beard was swirling a suspicious yellow liquid, nodding solemnly and announcing, "You need more leeches." And just like that, another piece of history slips between the pages of absurdity and bedtime calm, settling down beside the quiet flicker of candlelight and a faint scent of rosemary. Speaking of herbs, let's drift onward, because there's another medieval remedy waiting patiently in the shadows, and this one involves a pigeon, a very small shoe, and something called blessed goose grease. There is a very particular kind of person who willingly lets a live weasel nibble on their ear because they heard it might cure a headache. That kind of person was surprisingly common in medieval Europe. Yes, if you lived in the year 1347 and your temples were pounding like church bells on a high feast day, your options for relief were dramatic, deeply unhygienic, and often involved woodland creatures. Physicians of the day, who were really more like enthusiastic guessers with access to leeches, might recommend pressing the warm belly of a freshly cooked frog against your forehead. Why? Because frogs were cold and moist, and headaches, according to Galenic theory, were caused by too much heat and dryness in the brain. This theory also applied to wine, bad dreams, and ex-wives, though documentation is sparse on that last one. But let's back up a touch and look at the broader picture of cranial discomfort in ye olden times. The medieval head, you see, was believed to be a miniature ecosystem, an alchemical crucible simmering with the humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. A migraine was never just a migraine. It was a tempest among the elements, a clash of cosmic fluids inside your skull. Naturally, the cure involved coaxing those rogue humours back into balance using very scientific means, like scented apples or snails boiled in ale. Now, let's be fair. Modern folk still rub wasabi on their muscles and drink celery smoothies for reasons no one quite understands. But medieval treatments had a particular flair for excess. If snails and frogs didn't bring blessed relief, there were herbs, powders, and powders made from burned herbs mixed with wine and sprinkled with prayers. Juniper berries were popular, though more commonly used as a deodorant than a medicine. In fact, one Italian doctor wrote that placing a sprig of juniper beneath your pillow would draw heat from the brain and dissuade unwholesome dreams. Sleep hygiene, medieval edition. Other remedies went further afield. Allegedly, tying a strip of parchment inscribed with a passage from the Gospel of John around your head could ease the pain. This might have worked simply by distracting the sufferer from the headache itself, possibly by making them worry that the local priest would yell at them for sacrilege. But some recommendations were more tactile. A procedure known as trepanation, for instance, a sort of early skull-altering technique involving drilling a hole straight into the cranium to let the headache escape. Yes, escape. Like it was a little goblin trapped in your temple, yearning for fresh air. Shockingly, some patients actually survived, which either says a lot about the resilience of the medieval human skull or the sheer relentlessness of head pain. For those less inclined to let their barber surgeon create scenic skylights in their heads, there were gentler options. A poultice made from crushed rose petals and vinegar might be applied to the temples, held in place with a kerchief soaking in. What else? Goose grease. Goose grease was the medieval answer to everything from sore knees to marital discord. If it didn't cure the ailment, it at least gave one the pleasing sheen of a well-buttered muffin. And still, others insisted the best remedy was music. The gentle drone of a hurdy-gurdy, or the soft notes of a lute strummed by candlelight. While this wouldn't correct any imbalance of humours, it might lull you into forgetting the pain entirely. Not unlike how this very story is slowly lulling you into forgetting whatever small aches or busy thoughts the day may have left behind. It's astonishing how often medieval cures seem less like medicine and more like performance art. A spontaneous play staged by someone who got their hands on some time and thought, "Why not? I've nothing to lose but cognitive function." Still, underneath all that, beneath the weasel bites and lukewarm frog patties, was a very human desire to heal, to help, and to hush the noise in the mind. And don't we all seek that in one form or another, even now? So rest your weary temples and let the night cool what's been warm all day. For up ahead waits another curious corner of medieval life, where health advice, once more, defies classification, logic, and often gravity. Somewhere in the damp stone corridors of 14th century Europe, between the flickering candlelight and the persistent scent of boiled leeks and regret, lived a doctor who believed urine could talk. Not metaphorically, literally. You see, during the medieval period, one of the most popular and respected diagnostic tools was a technique known dramatically as uroscopy. The principle was divinely simple. Pour a sample of someone's urine into a clear flask, appropriately called a matula, and then closely inspect its color, clarity, sediment, and aroma to learn the secrets of their internal affairs. Doctors would study this vessel as if it were a hazy golden snow globe of truth. Feeling blue? Your urine probably isn't, but if it ever turned greenish black, you could expect your physician to shake his head gravely and tell you your liver was moonlighting as a blacksmith. The uroscopic charts of the day were truly a rainbow of concern. Amber honey meant moderate melancholy, pale like spring water. You were either incredibly healthy or had been frightened by a goose. Goose-induced fright was a legitimate health concern. And red, despite its rather alarming indication that something may be deeply wrong, could also be explained away as you've been thinking too much about passion. Lest you think this was a fringe practice relegated to back-alley alchemists, consider that an entire field of medical studies was built around this careful pea-staring pastime. Doctors would even carry urine, wheels, circular diagrams helping them translate hues and floating bits into Latin-tinged diagnoses, all without needing to speak to the patient. Convenient, if slightly unsettling. There are records of medieval physicians diagnosing everything from kidney disease to demonic possession, all thanks to a thoughtfully presented flask of wee. Patients were often encouraged to deliver their samples via trusted couriers, who might gallop urgently across town with a bladderful of hope sloshing in their satchel, dodging puddles and judgmental glances. The medical world at the time had a deep fascination with the body's fluids. Urine, blood, sweat, bile, and phlegm formed the medieval version of an all-star body politics team. These so-called humours needed to be in balance, or your spirit would get rebellious. Uroscopy provided a handy way of assessing your humoral harmony without sticking anything sharp into your person. Of course, accuracy was, how shall we say, negotiable. If it rained on the day your sample was taken, or if the courier had taken an extra bumpy route, your diagnosis might shift from healthy as a knight to has 6 hours to live. Temperature fluctuations could skew results. Dust, sunlight, or simply the natural human habit of peeing inconsistently could lead to wild conclusions. But doctors persisted, frowning sagely at flasks like Renaissance sommeliers, perhaps whispering, "Ah, yes," notes of melancholy with a phlegmatic finish. By the 14th century, physicians even began incorporating astrology into urine analysis. Now the stars, in tandem with your bladder, would dictate your fate. A patient might be told that Saturn was particularly grumpy in Scorpio, leading to sluggish kidneys and a general propensity toward wandering thoughts and damp socks. And yet, in all this amber-coloured pondering, there was progress. Uroscopy, for all its false starts and whiffs of charlatanism, laid the groundwork for future observations. It marked an early attempt to understand the interior world of the body through outward signs, even if those signs came in jars. The tradition has faded, thankfully, and today's doctors rely on slightly more refined tools to read our bodily signals. But somewhere inside your local hospital's automated urinalysis machine, perhaps a spectral medieval doctor still lingers, stroking his beard, whispering, "Ah yes, cloudy, with a hint of basil," clearly a case of left-leaning melancholia. And as we slip further into this candlelit maze of odd remedies and fragrant prognoses, our next stop takes us not to the mysteries of urine, but to an even more baffling substance, one that was prescribed not only medicinally, but also spiritually. Get comfortable. The cure, you see, might just come from a corpse. If you ever find yourself transported mysteriously back to the 13th century, and let's be honest, stranger things have happened, you'll want to remember a few medieval rules for surviving the dinner table. Not because the food is dangerous, though it frequently was, but because even eating was governed by a labyrinth of health advice, etiquette, and what we now know to be sheer guesswork wrapped in a turnip leaf. Imagine a lavish noble feast. Candles flicker warmly across polished pewter plates, roast boar glistens with honey glaze, and jellied fish shaped like actual fish jiggles seductively in the candlelight. But beware, your health depends heavily on when you eat, what you eat, and perhaps most baffling of all, with whom you eat. Let's start with order. According to medical wisdom of the day, one should first eat delicate fruits, if they must be eaten at all. These opening foods prepared the stomach, much like sweeping the hearth before laying a fire. Following this fruity prelude, a wise diner would proceed to light meats, perhaps fowl or rabbit, before moving on to the heavyweight champions like beef or venison. It wasn't just a matter of taste. Physicians warned that consuming heavy meats before light could result in a condition described ominously as meat confusion. Symptoms may have included indigestion, mild dizziness, and an alarming tendency to quote Aristotle at inappropriate moments. Drinks followed a similar logic. Water was, by many accounts, suspicious. Though abundant, it had the untrustworthy quality of being clear and cheap, leading many to prefer the safety of ale, not necessarily because it was stronger, but because, well, they boiled it. And in a time before microscopes, boiling was the closest they got to murdering invisible troublemakers. Wine, of course, was considered the gentleman's purifier, especially when it came infused with herbs that tasted deeply and medicinally of dirt. Once seated at the table, a host of rules suddenly materialized, ranging from don't pick your teeth with your knife to don't stare too long at the person opposite you, lest you cause them to choke on fear or bread or both. And remember, no crossing your legs while eating, not because it was rude, but because crossing your limbs could interfere with the natural flow of digestive spirits, which is a poetic way of saying, we have no idea how stomachs work. One particularly curious belief held that laughter during meals was dangerous. Not merely bad manners, dangerous. Scholars warned that sudden bursts of cheer might cause your spleen to tremble, or your humours to clash like badly cast jousters. In truth, it probably just resulted in someone spewing soup unexpectedly, which is, across all centuries, an unfortunate form of slapstick. Now, if you thought your medieval host was done wagging a paternal finger at your dining habits, think again. Post-meal advice, arguably more bizarre, urged one to walk precisely 100 steps after eating. No more, no less. This wasn't random whimsy. The ancients believed that walking 100 paces helped guide the food downward, even though nobody could explain where it was supposed to be going. Not to be outdone by facts, the health guides declared that lying down too soon after a meal could cause vapors to rise into the head, potentially leading to melancholic dreams, an upset liver, or the sudden urge to write terrible poetry under the moonlight. Still want dessert? The sweets of the time were not terribly sweet by modern standards. Think spiced figs or honeyed almonds. But they were considered medicinal in their own right. Sugar, when not prohibitively expensive, was given in the form of comfits, seeds coated in layer upon layer of hardened sugar, considered ideal for sealing the digestion. Essentially, medieval antacids that also made your breath smell slightly more papal. Of course, if things did go awry, if you overindulged in lamprey pie or attempted to digest a goose before it finished hissing, fear not. Medieval medical guides had the answer. A nice, reassuring purge. The options ranged from gentle herbal laxatives to more spirited methods like leeches or the medieval version of ipecac, likely administered with all the tender subtlety of a marching band. And yet, despite the frenzy of rules and remedies, the act of dining was a genuine moment of joy. It was where philosophy mixed with gossip, where minstrels played softly in the corner, and where your local herbalist might lean in, generously recommending that you chew violet petals if your stomach was, and I quote, having a sad time. Soon, night settles across the hall. Candles sputter and sigh. The final goblets are drained, and somewhere in the distance, a monk is carefully recording today's meal using 9 different adjectives for lukewarm. But there is still one last morsel of medieval health wisdom we must nibble before sleep claims us entirely. Let's step gently now into the soft, candlelit haze where dreams begin to blur with ancient beliefs. Eventually, we arrive at the end of this curious medieval menagerie. The twilight of old remedies, peculiar physicians, and increasingly questionable decisions involving poultry. Just as the moon rises over the soot-streaked rooftops of London or the lavender hills of Provence, let us take a final stroll down the dim corridors of medieval medicine, hand in herbal-scented glove, to a practice so absurdly cherished, they gave it a Latin name to make it sound important. Theriac. No, not a classical composer or an extravagant medieval tapestry designer. Theriac was, in theory, a cure-all, a panacea, the smoothie of the ancient world, rebranded by medieval apothecaries with more ingredients than a witch's leftovers. Over time, it became a dizzying blend of sometimes 64 components, ground and mixed and potted, including cinnamon, opium, bits of snake, yes, serpent, occasionally pearls, and always a little ancient swagger. If you were fortunate enough to own Theriac, you had in your possession an elixir thought to defend against poison, the plague, unwanted dinner guests, and possibly boredom. Royal physicians adored it. Emperor Nero's doctor, Andromachus, supposedly revived an early version, which I suppose is one way to distract your employer from fiddling while Rome burns. Later, it became so coveted that the Republic of Venice turned its preparation into an annual performance, complete with public inspections, ceremonial stirring, and enough powdered myrrh to make the air smell like holy incense and oddly damp toast. But history was not devoid of healthy skepticism. One monk, possibly raising a skeptical eyebrow far before it became fashionable, noted that Theriac was often so expensive and elaborate that those who could afford it probably didn't need it, and those who truly needed it couldn't afford more than a glance through the apothecary's window. And then there was green, glowing urine. Yes, the phenomenon of using urine as diagnostic glitter. Physicians believed that by examining a patient's wee under various angles of sunlight, ideally holding it up in a glass flask like a medieval sommelier, they could divine your innermost ailments. Bubbly urea, clearly a bubbling fever, pale golden glow, possibly melancholy, solid chunks floating in the sample? Well, first of all, yikes. Please alert your local wise woman at once. They even had a chart, uroscopy wheels, painted in surprising detail, each segment mapping shade to sickness, like a grim rainbow of kidney complaints. Some believed you could diagnose problems of the soul through the shimmering honesty of one's bladder. An entire category of symptom detectivism emerged. Fecal augury. Yes again. Medieval physicians, at times indistinguishable from overly confident sorcerers, recommended examining one's stool with the rigor of a wine critic. The consistency, the hue, the bouquet. It's unclear whether anyone ever spoke fondly of its aroma. But then again, daily hygiene wasn't thrown high on the priority list in certain corners of the 12th century. Still, for every bizarre belief, there was often a kernel of earnest curiosity beneath. Humans fumbling their way through the thick fog of limited knowledge, grasping for patterns where none existed, or sometimes stumbling over truths in the most unlikely of scenarios. They didn't know about bacteria, but they knew pain. They didn't understand viruses, but they cried at funerals and scribbled prayers on vellum walls. They grit herbs with mortar, plucked leeches from bowls, and steadied shaking hands because hope, like bad advice, is alarmingly persistent. And if you've ever doubted whether someone could fall asleep beside a fire, clutching a poultice of warm mashed turnips to their forehead, rest assured, it happened nightly, often with a grateful sigh and a whisper to Saint Apollonia, patroness of toothaches and dental hysteria. She no doubt heard more than she bargained for. Now we dim the torchlight. The herbal tinctures settle back on their crooked shelves. The plague masks are hung like oddly shaped birdhouses, and the village midwife snoozes in a chair, still clutching a sack of medicinal eels. Outside, the fields at last fall quiet. Fresh night air rustles the thatched roofs, and even the rats are at rest, possibly bloated from someone's leftover theriac. And you, dear listener, wander now toward sleep, guided by the soft hum of history's oddities. You know more than you did an hour ago, and perhaps, through the warmth of laughter and the glow of knowing, you now feel just a little more human. Close your eyes, breathe deep, and let the past exhale. Good night.